Ever considered the criteria for rising to be among the most hated persons in American history? What motivates someone to perform not one, but dozens of horrible crimes, leaving a path of victims behind? Today we investigate the terrible case of Gary Ridgway, sometimes known as the Green River Killer, a guy whose name makes one shudder. Gary Ridgway arrived into an apparently perfect environment marked by beautiful white picket fences, frequent Sunday church services, and the hopeful post-war America. Born in Salt Lake City, Utah, on February 18, 1949, Ridgway spent his early years in a standard suburban area. But under the surface of this perfect existence was a very darker narrative being written. Within a familial dynamic, Gary was seen by his neighbors and peers as a quiet person wedged between his distant father, Thomas, and his authoritarian mother, Mary Ridgway. But Gary lived in a toxic environment that would have a big impact on his future in ways not even imagined. Particularly throughout the several years he battled bedwetting, a humiliation that sometimes resulted in brutal punishment. His dominating mother embarrassed him regularly. This unrelenting cycle of guilt and humiliation severely traumatized little Gary. His social contacts were difficult, he suffered intellectually, and he was sometimes called as weak in development. Teachers and friends often undervalued him, not realizing that beyond his calm demeanor boiled a deep and perhaps dangerous resentment. Gary had unpleasant and distressing dreams in his adolescent years that would eventually become a hazardous obsession. Gary learned to cover his inner conflict under a surface of normalcy as he got older. He entered the Navy after graduating and valiantly served in Vietnam. Still, the event had no effect to calm his inner demons. He returned and stayed in Seattle, Washington, then started a consistent career as a truck painter for Kenworth Trucking Company. He wed several times and even had Matthew, a son. To others close by, he was simply another diligent man attempting to support his family. Underneath this facade, though, Ridgway was fighting a developing need to murder. Early in the 1980s, Ridgway's dreams become a terrible reality. Targeting vulnerable women, especially sex workers and runaways, people society had mostly ignored, he started patrolling Seattle. Ridgway understood these women were easy targets. Promising money or a ride, he would get them into his vehicle. But the real nightmare started once they were alone. Ridgway killed using a technique as cruel as it was effective. With his bare hands, he would strangle his victims. Occasionally, he would use ligatures like belts or cords, watching as life passed from their eyes. He would then bury their remains in far-off locations along the Green River, a site that would eventually come to be associated with fear. Still, Ridgway felt that killing was insufficient. Sometimes weeks later, his fixation with dominance and power drove him back to the bodies of his victims. Often practicing necrophilia, a sick deed that let him repeatedly experience the moment of their death, he would transfer the remains to perplex researchers. Fear enveloped the Seattle region as the dead started to mount up. The Green River Task Force was established by the King County Sheriff's Office, knowing they were dealing with a serial murderer. Under the direction of Detective Dave Reichert, the task team labored nonstop, searching for clues and reviewing material. But Ridgway constantly one step ahead. He was painstaking in covering his traces, arranging dumped victims in groups, and occasionally even hiding pebbles on top of them. As mementos, he would often save little objects from his victims, ghoulish reminders of the life he had stolen. For years, Ridgway escaped capture, despite the best efforts of the task group. Following his identification as a suspect based on regular presence in places where the victims were last seen, especially along Pacific Highway South, he was even questioned by police in 1987. But Ridgway was a skilled manipulator. He cleared a polygraph test and was let go without any specific proof connecting him to the killings. For the researchers, it was a terrible blow that let Ridgway go on his murdering rampage unbridled. It was frightening how easily Ridgway could fool people close to him. To his colleagues, he was a consistent, although very average worker. To his son and wife, he was a guy of few words but usually consistency. He was quite dangerous because of this duality. He could show a front of normalcy while harboring such sinister motives. This exact normality let him slip through the holes of society's protections and go on years of undetectable killing frenzy. The police won't catch up with Gary Ridgway for over 2 decades. Advancements in DNA technology in 2001 brought the breakthrough researchers had been sorely lacking. Re-examining the DNA evidence gathered from the crime sites, it was abundantly evident that Gary Ridgway was the Green River Killer. The protracted search was ended. The whole scope of Ridgway's misdeeds was at last exposed when he was captured and taken before trial. Ridgway shockingly confessed to killing 49 women, although he insisted the real count was more like 71. Ridgway's cold and dispassionate description of how he chose his victims, killed them, and handled their bodies as though they were nothing more than objects startled the jury. But why would a guy engage in such horrible crimes? Psychologists who examined Ridgway's case agree that his killing spree was driven by his need for control as well as deep-seated resentment toward women, especially his mother. Ridgway claimed to see his victims as bad women, and he thought he was cleaning the planet of them, a warped vigilante in his own mind. Gary Ridgway's trial was a reckoning event for the whole community as well as for the victim families. It was a sobering reminder of the wickedness that may hide under the surface of even the most seemingly regular people. As Ridgway related his atrocities with a startling lack of regret, the courtroom was charged with a range of emotions: anger, anguish, astonishment. Seeking some sort of closure, family members of the victims had the chance to face Ridgway in court and communicate their suffering and loss. Though many found solace in Ridgway's sentence, it could never fully heal the harm he had done. Many believed that his sentence, life in jail without the chance of parole, was too mild given the scope of his offenses. For the families of the victims, however, it was at least a kind of justice, a means of guaranteeing Ridgway would never injure another person once more. Gary Ridgway's crimes still have an influence now. The families of his victims are left with an unfillable emptiness, and the terror he caused in the society looms large over the Green River. Still a site of grief, the spot where the bodies were discovered serves as a reminder of the lives lost and the horror that once engulfed the society. For many, the Green River represents the tragedy that occurred there, rather than just a geographical aspect. But for those who had lived in terror for so long, Ridgway's capture also gave some sort of closure, however little. The Green River Task Force's relentless effort and developments in forensic technology finally brought one of America's most infamous serial killers to justice. The case also underlined the need of tenacity in law enforcement, as it demonstrated how finally even the most elusive offenders might be apprehended. Serving several life sentences without the chance of release, Gary Ridgway will spend his whole life in jail. But his narrative reminds us grimly that evil may strike anywhere, even in the most commonplace of settings. It reminds us that under the mask of normalcy, there may lie a darkness so deep that it defies comprehension. A darkness that, in Gary Ridgway's case, created a path of terror never forgotten. Gary Ridgway's narrative serves as a sobering warning about the human heart's propensity for evil as much as a horror thriller. Not only because of the crimes carried out, but also because of the terrifying awareness that someone like Gary Ridgway might be hidden in plain sight, blending in with the rest of us, waiting for the right opportunity to strike. This will haunt us always.